At 7:42 a.m. on August 17, 1943, Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouched beneath the left wing of a P-38 Lightning at Dobajura Airfield in New Guinea, the humid air heavy with fuel fumes and heat. He watched Lieutenant Robert Hayes climb into the cockpit, a 23-year-old farm kid from Iowa with 6 combat missions and 0 kills, fully aware that this flight might be the one he wouldn't return from. Intelligence had reported 18 Japanese Mitsubishi A6M Zeros moving into the patrol area, and Hayes would be flying straight toward them. McKenna had been maintaining P-38s for 8 months and knew the aircraft intimately: twin engines, twin booms, brutally fast in a straight line, devastating at altitude, yet burdened by a flaw that was killing American pilots every week. The P-38 could not turn with a zero. The Japanese fighter was lighter, more agile, able to complete a horizontal turn in nearly half the time, and in a close dogfight, that difference meant death. American doctrine was absolute: never turn with a zero, use speed and altitude, dive in, fire, climb away. But Hayes had followed that doctrine on every mission, and it had failed him each time. The Zeros were patient and intelligent, luring American pilots into turns, cutting inside their radius, sliding onto their tails, and destroying them with clinical precision. In the past 6 weeks alone, the 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s, most of them shot down after being trapped in turning engagements. They couldn't escape. McKenna had watched it happen again and again, watching young pilots taxi out with confidence and either come back in pieces or not come back at all. Official reports blamed pilot error, claimed the men weren't following doctrine, but McKenna knew the truth lay deeper inside the aircraft itself. The P-38's aileron control cables ran a long, complex path through the twin booms, around pulleys, and back to the wings, and within that system was a small but deadly flaw: slack. Barely 3/8 of an inch, well within factory tolerance, yet enough to create a fractional delay between stick movement and aileron response during hard, low-speed turns. At high speed, it didn't matter, but in a tight maneuver, that fraction of a second was the difference between rolling inside a zero's turn and being perfectly lined up for a killing burst. McKenna had reported it to an engineering officer months earlier and was told the tension was within specifications, that any modification would violate regulations and void warranties, and that Lockheed 7,000 miles away in California would have to approve any changes. After watching 17 pilots die, McKenna decided the regulations were wrong. On the morning of Hayes' mission, he took a piece of piano wire from a damaged aircraft, cut it to 6 inches, bent it into a Z shape, and quietly installed it as a tensioner on Hayes' left aileron control cable. The entire modification took 8 minutes and added less than half a pound of tension, eliminating the slack completely. No one noticed. The inspection crew focused on engines, oil, and ammunition. McKenna said nothing. He stepped back, watched Hayes taxi to the runway, watched the P-38 lift off into the pale morning sky, and disappear toward the Japanese fighters. What happened in the next 17 minutes would change how every P-38 in the Pacific would fly. 17 minutes after Lieutenant Robert Hayes lifted off from Dobajura, the sky over the jungle erupted into chaos. The Japanese Zeros arrived exactly where intelligence said they would, slicing through the morning air in loose formation, confident, aggressive, hunting. Hayes spotted them first, sunlight flashing across silver wings, and pushed his throttles forward, climbing for position just as doctrine demanded. The initial pass was fast and violent. Hayes dove from altitude, engines screaming, closed on a zero from above and behind, and opened fire. Traces tore through the air as the zero snap rolled left and tried to drag him into a turn. This time, when Hayes rolled to follow, the airplane answered instantly. No hesitation. No sluggish resistance. The P-38 rolled clean and hard, tighter than it ever had before, and for the first time since arriving in New Guinea, Hayes felt the aircraft move exactly when he told it to. The Zero pilot misjudged the roll, expecting the familiar delay, and for a split second his aircraft hung exposed. Hayes squeezed the trigger again and watched pieces tear off the Zero's left wing as it spiraled down into the jungle. Hayes didn't chase it. He climbed exactly as he'd been trained, but now with something new: confidence. 2 more Zeros came in from above, reversing hard to trap him, and Hayes broke left, then right, rolling and diving in a maneuver that should have left him dead. Instead, the P-38 stayed with him, smooth and responsive, slipping out of their gun sights by inches. His wingman called out targets. Hayes came back down in a shallow dive, fired a short burst, and watched another Zero trail smoke and peel away. The fight was over almost as quickly as it began. The surviving Japanese pilots disengaged, stunned by a P-38 that suddenly behaved differently than the one they had learned to kill. When Hayes landed back at Dobajura, his aircraft bore new bullet holes and scorched paint, but he climbed out of the cockpit alive, shaken and smiling in disbelief. He had 2 confirmed kills. McKenna was waiting on the ramp, pretending to check a tool cart while watching Hayes walk toward him. Hayes stopped, looked at him, and said only one sentence: "The airplane felt different." McKenna nodded, said nothing, and went back to work. Within a week, quiet changes began appearing across the flight line. Crew chiefs talked. Mechanics listened. Control cables were adjusted just a little tighter than the book allowed. No paperwork changed. No reports were filed. But pilots started coming back alive. Kill ratios improved. Turning fights no longer meant automatic death. Months later, Lockheed engineers would officially redesign the P-38's control system, citing combat feedback from the Pacific. By then, dozens of pilots owed their lives to a 6-inch piece of piano wire installed by a mechanic who refused to accept that, within specifications, was good enough. By September, the change was impossible to ignore. Pilots who had arrived in New Guinea expecting to survive only a handful of missions were now coming back again and again, their aircraft scarred but controllable, their confidence growing with every engagement. The official briefings didn't change, the doctrine stayed the same on paper, but in the air something fundamental had shifted. P-38 pilots began reporting that the airplane finally felt honest, that it responded the instant they moved the stick, that in a hard brake or rolling dive it no longer lagged behind their intentions. They still avoided turning fights whenever possible, but now, when a Zero forced the issue, they weren't helpless anymore. Japanese pilots, who had grown used to exploiting that fractional delay, began overshooting, misjudging lead, finding American fighters suddenly where they didn't expect them to be. McKenna kept his head down and his mouth shut, installing his quiet fix whenever he could without drawing attention. Never writing it in a logbook, never speaking of it outside whispered conversations on the line. He watched names stop appearing on the casualty board. He watched pilots he'd expected to lose shake his hand after missions, laughing, exhausted, alive. By October, word had traveled far enough that senior officers started asking questions not about modifications, but about results. Why were P-38 losses dropping? Why were kill claims rising? Why were pilots suddenly staying in the fight longer and coming home? Engineers would later explain it in clean language: control harmonization, improved roll response, reduced control latency, but none of those words captured the reality McKenna had lived with for months. The reality was 17 minutes over the jungle, a split-second roll, and a Zero pilot who expected an American fighter to hesitate and found himself wrong. Years later, after the war, when official histories credited redesigned control systems and factory updates, McKenna never corrected them. He didn't need credit. He carried something heavier and quieter, the knowledge that sometimes wars don't turn on grand strategy or famous aces, but on a mechanic who refuses to believe that within spec is good enough when lives depend on it. After the war, the story never made it into manuals or medals. Technical Sergeant James McKenna returned to California quietly, took a job in a small garage outside Long Beach, and spent the rest of his life working with his hands. When people asked what he did during the war, he said he fixed airplanes. He didn't mention New Guinea. He didn't mention piano wire. He didn't mention the nights he lay awake wondering how many men would have lived if he'd acted sooner. The pilots scattered across the country, some staying in the Air Force, others disappearing into ordinary lives, carrying memories they rarely spoke about. A few of them wrote letters years later, thanking an unnamed mechanic for an airplane that finally listened to them when it mattered most. McKenna kept those letters in a box under his workbench, folded and oil-stained, never showing them to anyone. Official histories would later credit Lockheed engineers with refining the P-38's control systems based on combat feedback, and that was true, in its own way. But the feedback had been written in burning wreckage and empty bunks, and the first fix hadn't come from a design office. It had come from a flight line in New Guinea, from a man who broke regulations because he was tired of watching kids die for a problem no one wanted to acknowledge. By the time the war ended, the P-38 had earned its reputation as a DEA,